Good morning, everybody.
Morning, Rabbi.
Okay, so yesterday we started Sif Hay in the Rav Shulchan Aruch regarding the law of selling property to another person. We know that there's a halacha of the way there's a hierarchy. When it comes to real estate, there's this concept of called bar metzra, which means that you have to give first rights of refusal to someone who has an adjoining property. And so that was the first thing that the Shulchan Aruch had said. And then if there is no adjoining property, then there's a different hierarchy of prioritization. The first priority goes to a Talmud Chacham, as we said, that if a Talmud Chacham wishes to purchase, you have to give it to him first. Second priority, we said, is a good friend. The third priority is a relative. The fourth priority is someone who lives in your neighborhood. Fifth priority is someone who lives in the same city. And then finally, you can give it to any person you want if according to this prioritization. So before we go further in this prioritization, I wanted to just look at a couple of points of a bar metzra that we had touched upon briefly yesterday. In the Likutim, he writes as follows: Baal HaMeitzar, everyone see in the Likutim, Bar HaMeitzar, the person who lives on the adjoining property or the owner of the adjoining property. Hamocher liisha o liyasomim ketanim ein bo mishum dina de bar metzra. He says, if a person wishes to sell a property to a woman or to orphans whose estate is being supervised by a custodian, and they're the desired purchaser, so then you can sell it to them even without giving first rights of refusal to a person with an adjoining property. Now, what's the reason for that? So this is a halacha in Shulchan Aruch, Siman Kuf Ayin Hey Sif Mem Zayin, and let's see, I'll put it up over here, and can everyone see the Shulchan Aruch now? Hamocher liisha o liyasomim ketanim. The Shulchan Aruch writes that if you sell a property to a woman or to small orphans, and the Ramah says this is to the exclusion of adult orphans, or children who are not orphans but have a father, ein bo mishum dina de bar metzra. There's no law of bar metzra. There's no law of first rights of refusal to a person who has the adjoining property. So what's the reason for that? So as the Nesivos actually, here, we'll look at the Sma. He explains, Mishum de lo shayach lemeimer behu dehin yimsu liknos b'makom acher, the lav bar hachihem. He says, because the whole argument, and actually it's probably better if we look at the Nesivos. He says, the ikar taimahu dehin yimsu liknos b'makom acher. He says, the whole reason why you give first rights of refusal to a person who's has an adjoining property is because when someone comes to purchase from you, the ethical thing to do is to say, listen, I would love to sell to you, but I have to give, the ethical thing is to allow the neighbor on this property to expand his own property and with the adjoining property. That's the ethical thing to do. And the buyer can say to you, but wait a minute, I came to you first. Isn't it ethical to sell it to me first? And the seller's response to that is, there's plenty of property available. Go ahead. It's an open market. You can find a property somewhere else. But this guy only has, one adjoining property. So I have to offer it to him first. But there's a counter argument if you're dealing with a woman or if you're dealing with orphans. They don't have, say, the same access to the open market as a male does in a male-dominated society. And therefore, the Shulchan Aruch is compassionate to the societal disadvantage that women and children are at, certainly in the medieval world. And therefore it says that if a woman comes to you wishing to purchase your property, you have to assume that she's not going to have the same opportunity to purchase property in other places. And therefore it's no more ethical for you to sell it to your neighbor than to sell it to her, because she also will be out of a purchase if you don't sell the property to her. It's just like for the person with the adjoining property, it's a unique opportunity. So too for her, it's a unique opportunity, because you have to assume that opportunities are going to be closed to her in the outside society. So that's the compassion behind this halacha. And the same thing applies to Yisomim. It applies to orphans as well. We assume that they're not going to have equal opportunities to purchase property in the open market. And therefore, and that's why the halacha is masha'inkein b'ktanim she'enam yisomim. He says, and that's the reason why there's a distinction drawn between minors who have a father and minors who don't have a father. Minors who have a father, they're not yisomim, and therefore we assume avi and matriach ba'adan, their father can always deal for them in the open market. They'll have someone to protect them, someone to be able to make sure that they don't get exploited. Aval yisomim afilu yesh lahen apotropos les dina de bar metzra. But if they're orphans, even if they're under a custodial watch, someone is a custodian on their property, nonetheless, we have to assume that it's not going to be as easy for them, because no one can watch over them like a father. Even a custodian who's hired to manage their assets may not take the same level of concern for them as a parent does, and therefore you have to view this opportunity of purchase as a unique opportunity. And the same applies even if the person who owns the adjoining property is a female, and another female wants to purchase it from me. I don't have to give first rights of refusal to the other to the female who owns the adjoining property. In other words, I have to view it as each female is coming as with a unique opportunity, and neither of them will have an easy time finding property somewhere else. And so therefore there's no priority to be given to one over the other. So if the outside woman comes first and wants to purchase it, I have to give it to her first. So this is a fascinating sociological halacha based upon the inherent disadvantage that women have in a pre-20th century society. And the halacha takes that into consideration and therefore says, try and make sure that with the understanding that they may be exploited or may be denied opportunities in the outside open market, you have to be extra compassionate to them. The question, of course, is, would this halacha apply in the 21st century, right? Where women have, now, of course, a woman would say, well, the halacha should give me equal opportunity, right? But you see, in this situation, if the halacha gives you equal opportunity, we deny you a privilege that was given to you by the medieval authorities. But of course, you can't have your cake and eat it too, right? So, but when it comes, in many instances, when it comes to Hilchos tzedakah, many of these halachas still apply, even in the 21st century. And like in the Hilchos tzedakah, if a man comes to you and a woman comes to you and they're both poor, and they are seeking tzedakah, and you have limited assets, your priority should first be to the woman before it is to the man. Because again, it's the same kind of principle, that with a man, there's an assumption that he'll be able to have an easier time finding tzedakah money to survive than a woman will. And the same thing is true with minors versus adults in the same vein. But it's interesting how it translates into the real estate market, and to really just in purchases in general. I think if a woman were to see this halacha today, she would say, "Oh, how repugnant, how discriminatory, how sexist." Well, madam, it's a reality of society in the medieval world. Anything that is 20th century. This was the simple reality. Is it true to a certain extent today? In Hilchos Tzedakah, I think it still applies. I'm not sure if it applies in the open market, though, as far as when you have women of mega billion-dollar corporations, Fortune 500 companies, when you have women who are the CEOs, I'm not sure if this halacha applies anymore. Comments, questions?
All right. With that said, with respect to widows and orphans, I presume that part may well still apply. They're still disadvantaged. And we always have this thing in the Torah about widows, orphans, and converts. I was just wondering whether there's any extension to that or whether it's just widows and orphans specifically on the real estate.
On the real estate, it applies to women, and it doesn't say an almana. It says a woman. But in this situation, I think, let me just see, there's a concern that you have to make sure that she's, let me just say, what did I see before? You have to be able to, you have to verify, I'm trying to see where I saw it. You have to verify that she's not a straw man purchasing on behalf of her husband. So that's the thing, is that you have to, it seems that she's a single woman. She doesn't have to specifically be an almana. She could be a divorcee, or she could be a single woman also. But that's what this halacha is applying to. Here in the Ramah, he says Haggah. V'davka, do you see it? Do you see it on your screen? The Ramah says V'davka isha sheyesh la nechasim yeduim o almana. He says it must be specifically referring to a woman who we know has her own independent bank account, or a widow. She'ein lacho shemaremes v'kona l'bayla v'omeres la'atzma, where you can verify that she's not being deceitful and buying instead on behalf of her husband, which would be a good shtick, right? She would, her husband would say, honey, I want to buy that property, but he's going to give first rights of refusal to his neighbors. So you go ahead and you represent my interests and buy it on my behalf. So you have to be able to, according to the Ramah, she's allowed to be married, but it has to be verified that the particular assets that she's using to purchase the property belong independently to her. Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
All right, good. Okay, let's go back to the Imrei Yaakov. All right, so he also says in the next piece of the Likutim, Gam bebatim kaimelan diyesh bahen. He says when it comes to purchasing homes, there's also the law of first rights of refusal that you have to give to the neighbor. Now, I remember I touched on this briefly yesterday. Is there such a din of bar metzra when it comes to a home purchase? He says, Hol vehem mechubarim lakarka, because a home has its status of real estate also. Din bar metzra chmo shekasu kan harav, b'davkim heim smuchim, but only if the houses are attached. If the houses are attached, like townhouses, right? So then, or a duplex, so then there's a law of bar metzra, because the neighbor can say, this is a tremendous advantage for me, because now I can expand and turn the townhouse into one unit so that I can have a house double the size. And that's a legitimate argument in halacha. So if you want to sell your townhouse and your neighbor wishes to, or I guess in theory, your condo, and your neighbor says, I would like to buy it, you have to give first rights of refusal to your neighbor. But that's only if they're attached. But if they're detached homes, and there's the possibility of people walking in between the homes, then there's no din of a bar metzra. There's no requirement for you to sell it if it's not realistic for the houses to be attached and combined. Now, one could make an argument that there are certain homes that are detached, but the space between the two homes is so narrow that it is theoretically possible to attach them. You'd have to be able to make that determination. in order to be able to say halachically, you have to give me first rights of refusal. And then he writes, V'hu adin, this is really a fascinating halacha, V'hu adin b'mekomos yeshiva b'veis hakneses yesh din bar metzra. Here's another example where the law of bar metzra. Let's say a guy has a makom kavua in the Beis HaKnesses. He has a fixed seat in the shul, and he's moving to Florida, and he's now going to be selling his seat to other people who would like to purchase it from him. This is talking about in places where the shul was in a situation where everyone owns his seat because he purchases it, and when he leaves, he's allowed to sell it, or the shul's allowed to sell the seat to another person. They can sell the makom kavua. We don't have that at the bayit. We're actually talking about doing that at the bayit as a fundraiser, which is to sell rows of seats, or to where people can purchase a makom kavua, right? There's a lot of pros and cons, but this was the convention in the medieval world in certain communities, where you would purchase your makom kavua, and you would have a little sign that this is so and so seat. And let's say the guy's moving to Florida, he's moving out of town, and the shul or the individual wants to sell the seat to somebody else. You have to give first rights of refusal to a guy who's sitting on either side of that seat, because let's say he wants to buy it for his son-in-law, right, or someone else. That's he wants to be able to expand his domain within the shul. So you have to give first rights of refusal to that person as well. So, okay. Let's see. All right. So that's some of the things having to do with the bar mitzvah. I want us to go further in the Imrei Yaakov, because we just started touching on the Imrei Yaakov. And we said, now that we've discussed a little bit about the law of bar mitzvah, let's go into the Imrei Yaakov. We talked about whether or not you have to give priority to a Talmud Chacham Bizman Hazeh, whether there is such thing as a Talmud Chacham Bizman Hazeh. We learned that already in the 13th century, they were suggesting that there are really no Talmidei Chachamim like there were in the olden days. And therefore, based on that, if I don't sell it to a Talmud Chacham, the Talmud Chacham has no legal recourse. It's only a lechatchila that we say that if a person is a recognized Torah authority, then there is lechatchila at least an imperative to try and accommodate his desire to make the purchase before someone who's not a Talmud Chacham. And what is this based on? It's based on a pasuk in Sefer Devarim, Ve'asista hayashar ve'hatov be'enei Hashem. You shall do that which is upright and good in the eyes of Hashem. And essentially what that pasuk implies is that when equity is created in a relationship between two people, whether the two people are relatives or friends, then you should acknowledge that equity and therefore give that person preferential treatment when all things are equal. Isa besifra parshas Bahar. So the Imrei Yaakov says that if we look in the Midrash on Parshas Bahar, we will see that the Torah writes, V'chisim karumim kar la'amisecha, o kano miyad amisecha. Now this pasuk talks about the laws of buying and selling and not exploiting a buyer or a seller. And the Torah writes that when you sell something to your friend, to your la'amisecha means your fellow countryman, your fellow Jew, or if you purchase something from your fellow Jew. So the Medrash says like this, Minayin kishata mocher mechor liyisrael chavercha. From where do we know that when you're selling, you have to give priority to a Jew who is your friend? Tamulomar v'chisim karumim kar la'amisecha mechor. That the Torah says when you sell an object to your countryman, so we see that there's an imperative to give priority to your fellow Jew. And how do we know that if you're coming to purchase something from a commodity, you should try to purchase it from a Jew, your fellow Jew first? So therefore the Torah says, when you purchase something from your friend, So it's very clear that you're supposed to try and purchase first from a Jew and sell first to a Jew when a Jew and a non-Jew come before you and you have the prospect of either buying from either of them or selling to either of them. Now, this is a well-forgotten halacha in many people's minds. But it's, and I have to say, I've talked about it from the Bima in the past when I mentioned it a few years ago. Like people, like they had no concept that it was even such a halacha that existed, that you have to give preferential treatment to a Jewish vendor over a non-Jewish vendor, that when all other things are equal, you should try to give the business to a Jew over a non-Jew. And the Imrei Yaakov continues and he says, V'hu hadin im tzarech liskar ezer davar limalachto. If let's say you need to rent something or lease something, yesh liskor mi Yisrael im hatoeles mishneim shaven. You should rent or lease from a Jew if the same object is attainable from both of them. Because kama post, and this is true also when it comes to goods, not only goods, but services as well. If let's say you want to hire a certain vendor who's providing a certain service, and one is a Jew and one is a non-Jew, you're supposed to give preferential treatment to the Jew when all things are equal. In other words, when you get the same service from either one of them. This is true when it comes to making simchas and so forth. I'm not going to go any further into this because there are certain service providers in our community who are well established, and I'm not interested in forcefully taking the business away from them. But it is important to know that there's such a halacha that exists. If you have a guy who's a florist or a musician, and he's Jewish, and you could easily use one or the other, you should try to give the benefit to the Jew and give the Jew your business. Because kama poskim da afilu im hanachri mosif yoser alamekach afilu hachi yesh limkor liYisrael b'pachos. He says, and there are poskim who goes even further, and they say that let's say you have two purchasers in front of you, one is a Jew and one is a non-Jew, and you're selling, and you can sell it to either of them, then even if the Gentile offers you more money, then it is still preferential. It is still preferable to give the purchase to the Jew who's offering you less. Now, how much less is not mentioned. We have to, obviously, if it's a huge differential, then we're not talking about that, and we'll see that more in the Likutim when we see some cases about this. And the same thing will be true if you're the purchaser, and you could either buy from a Jew or from a non-Jew. Even if you have to pay a little bit more to buy from the Jew, that would be the halachic preference. But that's only when it's a very small amount of money. Right? If it's a very, very small difference, the margin is very slight, then you should always give the Jew the business first. Okay. Now
would there be a convenience factor as well? Is it simply money, or is it all things equal, even with respect to
how you go
about
it? No, you're making a good point, Paul, but the convenience factor, even if it's slightly more inconvenient, but again, it's the operative word is slightly. If it's slightly more inconvenient for you to give the business to the Jew over the non-Jew, then there's still a mitzvah for you to give it to the Jew. But you have to be able to. It's a very subjective thing. You have to evaluate it. But at least you understand that there's this concept in halacha, right? If I can buy, I need to buy my a new set of light bulbs or whatever it is, and I can buy it from a Jew, or I could buy it from a non-Jew. And by the way, that's not just, let's say it's I know a Jew has a small mom and pop operation, and I can buy from him, or I could buy from the big box store, right? So there too, you have to try and give the job to the Jew first. Now, there's a lot of times when this is counterintuitive. Why? Because let's say you want to give the business to a Jew. There's a Jew in town who sells appliances, or you can buy it from the big box store. Well, here's a big issue. Let's say the Jew is willing to meet the same price as the big box store, right? And you want to give the business to the Jew. You should try to give the Jew the business. What happens, however, if the Jew has a reputation that if there's something wrong with the appliance, he's going to give you the runaround and not help you swap out the appliance, right? Sometimes the big box stores have a very generous exchange policy, right? And the mom and pop operation, right? He doesn't want to have to be bothered with if there's anything wrong with the appliance, then you can he'll come and pick it up and he'll swap it out for another appliance. He's not set up that way. I think that is an important consideration. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of mom and pop operations have been put out of business, not only because they can't compete price-wise with the big box stores, but also because their service and the way that they treat exchanges and defects is not the same. So I do feel that that's a fair that is a fair way of judging it. That if you feel that you don't want to get started with the Jew because if there's a defective appliance, you're going to have a big headache trying to get it exchanged, I think that is a fair argument. But again, when all things are equal, you do have an obligation to give the Jew the business first.
Rabbi?
Now, yeah.
Rabbi, I just want to ask you, a few years back, when there was really a craziness going on in our housing market here, in our particular community here, there were a lot of houses being sold to non-Jews, to foreign people buying houses, etc. And there was a little concern about like the area changing a little bit. Do we have a responsibility that way? That let's say if you're putting your house up for sale, could you say to the real estate agent, for example, I only want to sell to a Jew?
Well, if you did that, you might get into trouble. I'm not sure if that's legal, but you could say to your realtor, try to find me a Jewish buyer. I would rather give it to a Jew than to a non-Jew. That's perfect. That there is, I think there may be some level of social ethics involved that you want to try and preserve the nature of the community. I do feel that that's certainly an ethical imperative that every person should feel upon themselves. But I have to tell you that it's not just a few years back, Ron. I have a neighbor who just recently sold his house on my block, a member of the Bayit, and to move into a condo, one of those new condo townhouses that on the other side of Bathurst. And he told me that he put up his house for sale. Not a single frum Jew came to look at the house. So I'm not so sure that you can make the argument, that I have to hold out and not sell to, let's say, 10 people who come who are not Jewish in order to be able to hold out for that one Jew who is going to come. But if it's a seller's market and I've got a long line of people clamoring to buy the house and the Jew is putting up a bid that is similar within a small differential of everybody else, then yes, there's not only for the sake of the preservation of the frum nature of the neighborhood, but also because I'm supposed to give preferential treatment to a Jew who comes to purchase over a non-Jew.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Sorry, what if the Jew is of known shady character? Like he's a known criminal or terrible reputation, etc. in that situation?
You're right, Alan. It's got to be all things being equal. If and that's a terrible question, because unfortunately it's true. In other words, if you know that there's a member of your own community that is known to swindle other people, you should stay away from him. It doesn't matter how frum he is and how long his payas are. Right? That's just you have to protect yourself. So you're 100% right. The last thing is from this Imrei Yaakov is Kasav B'Shailos Tshuvas Chasam Sofer That when do we say you give preferential treatment to a Jew? According to the Chassam Sofer, is only when he's an observant Jew. But if he's not observant, then then there's no law of preferential treatment in buying and selling. And this is especially true if he flagrantly violates Shabbos in public. Then there's no mitzvah even of hashavas aved, of returning lost objects, as we'll see later on in the halacha. And then he says, I refer you to the Likutim. I need to qualify this statement of the Chassam Sofer very, very carefully, and hopefully we'll do that in Mirz Hashem tomorrow. So I want to just remind me we have to qualify this, because this divide that was made in the 19th century between observant and non-observant Jews, I don't feel is as applicable today as it used to be. We'll hold it here, and wish you all a great day. Take care.
Bye. Be well, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.